Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Welcome back to day two. We have a packed schedule. We have 1 hour this morning to look in more detail at the university rankings. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour of the rankings, but you'll have seen the highlights last night. You'll hopefully have read some of the newspaper headlines this morning. We've been trending on Twitter. We've been making international headlines, but this is a really good chance to scrutinize the data in more detail. So I'm delighted we have M'hamed el Aisati from Vice President at Elsevier, responsible for the Scopus database and one of the architects of the bibliometric work that Elsevier does. And Duncan Ross, our Chief Data Officer at THE. Please use Slido, THEWAS, as the entry code. We are pressed for time. We've got such a wonderful program today. We're only going to take an hour this morning, but any questions left over, we're going to go backstage and actually record our answers to them, and we'll share them with all the delegates. So it's really important that we are listening and transparent and accountable. So please do ask questions. If we don't get to them in this session, we will deal with them. So just to remind ourselves of where we are, the rankings, as I said last night, are based on really, really extensive data. We have the 68.7 million citations analyzed, and M'hamed's going to explore this in more detail, exactly what the sources are there. Well over 12 million, almost 13 million research publications looked at, and again, M'hamed will explain exactly which publications, which outputs we're looking at. And a massive thank you to the community for sharing data with us. We are getting a large amount of data from universities across the world, and it's really important to us that we're building something genuinely unique. We're building a database of data points that are mapped correctly across the world. We've created new data definitions to make sure we can really start understanding data across the world. So it's a fantastic resource that we build the rankings on, and that's thanks to the partnership we have with the universities around the world. More than 20,000 responses to our academic reputation survey, all of them randomly sampled but statistically representative of their country. We distribute that in 15 different languages using United Nations data to get a genuine representative sample of global scholarship. And of course, you'll have seen on the website and the magazine, we've ranked more than 1,250 institutions. I think it's 1,258, Duncan, am I correct, this year? From a database of more like 1,700. And as I said last night, 86 countries included in the rankings. So I want to really focus today on the results analysis, and M'hamed and Duncan have got some fantastic new data sets to play with. So I don't think we should spend too long on the methodology, but it is important that we're transparent about the methodology. So just a reminder, we have 13 performance indicators, the most balanced, the most comprehensive ranking system in the world. We have 5 what we describe as pillars, broad areas of activity that we're assessing. So we're looking at teaching, 30% weighting, research based on volume, income, and reputation. You can see there the reputation survey making up 18% of that research category. Another 30% for citations. This is field-weighted citation impact. M'hamed will explain more, but it's a wonderful way of reflecting how much your institution's scholarship is disseminated, shared, how much you're contributing to new knowledge, the impact of all your research papers. International outlook, we believe fundamentally that global research universities are fundamentally global. They have to be global. You can't be world-class without being global, solving the world's grand challenges in partnership. So we're looking at research paper collaboration across borders. We're looking at your ability to draw in talent, both faculty and students. So we're looking at the proportion of international students and international faculty there. So that's a very brief summary of the methodology, which will be important when we look later on at some of the specific data points. And again, just a very brief reminder of those highlights. The top 10, extraordinarily boring. I'm very sorry, hardly any movement, but that's great. One of my jobs when we reformed the rankings several years ago was, as a journalist, I want excitement, I want movement, but actually, as a data business, we want stability and we want sensible outcomes. So I'm quite pleased that we have a very stable result. The only real significant movement there was Yale moving into that top 10 for the first time under the current methodology, and ETH Zurich just slipping down into the 11th place. So just a very brief look at the sort of superstars there. I think it's a really interesting way to look at the massive differences in income, but actually some interesting results in terms of outcomes. So on the left-hand side there, we have the total institutional income adjusted for purchasing price parity of Yale, ETH, Stanford, Oxford. You can see actually Stanford super, super rich in terms of its total institutional income. But when you look at research income specifically per capita, per researcher, you can see actually there's a real evening out of the resource. And ETH is one of the most resource-rich institutions of that group. But when it comes to publication output, you can see Oxford and Stanford absolutely neck and neck, really, in terms of the volume of publications. So it's just interesting to look at, the rankings, even at the very top end. Institutions do have significantly different profiles in terms of their wealth, in terms of their productivity. So really, we're not really pushing a homogeneity. There is diversity even within those sort of super elite institutions. And then just before I hand over to Duncan, the top 200, we tend to use the top 200 as a bit of a barometer of change, and I think it is worth mentioning the US is still utterly dominant, 60 institutions in the top 200, but it has lost a couple of institutions. We are seeing overall a little bit of a stagnation of the US, but that's really driven by the rise of Asia. The United Kingdom's lost some institutions as well. Germany does very well with 23. The Netherlands, I always think, is one of the strongest nations in higher education terms, with pretty much all of its research-intensive universities making the top 200. It's a really great story. No superstars, but a wonderful system. China still has only 7. That's no change, but those 7 are making strides. Hong Kong has another 5. Hong Kong's had a great year. But just a snapshot, and Singapore, one of the most knowledge-intensive hotspots in the world, has 2 highly ranked institutions doing very well, NUS, of course, and Nanyang in 51st. But that's just a very broad summary. You've seen that. That's in our publication. So now to look in more detail, I'm thrilled to hand over to Duncan.
Thank you very much, Phil. By the way, who here survived my marathon session on Tuesday? Hands up. If you didn't survive, you don't have to put your hand up, obviously. Just as a reminder about the framework for how we think about universities. So today, and the focus of this conference has been very much about the importance of research. And our leading ranking, the World University Ranking, is fundamentally looking at research-intensive universities. As part of that, we also, of course, take that same data set and we use it to explore different factors, different elements of excellence. So, for example, we have the young universities that are 50 years old or newer. That used to be relatively straightforward, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to work out whether universities really are only 50 years old. We have, for example, the communes coming along in France, where we're seeing ancient universities being brought together into these new super universities. And I might say there are still a few universities out there who seem to have 2 minds about whether they were founded in the 1700s or in the 1960s. It's always fun juggling through that data. We look at reputation data separately, but we also look at data in terms of geography and in terms of 11 broad subject areas. We're also expanding our portfolio of analysis by looking at teaching. And this doesn't cover the whole world yet, because we have to look at a very different approach, which takes us country by country. But we now have teaching-focused rankings that look at the US, in collaboration with the Wall Street Journal, look at Japan, and now look at 8 European nations. And that's providing a very different insight into the role of universities. And then finally, we've started the process of gathering data, of thinking about how we can explore how universities support impact and innovation, particularly through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I would hope that many of your universities would be willing to participate in that new project, which we're going to be very excited to launch the first results in April next year. So where does the data for our World University Ranking come from? Well, we have 3 key data sources. The first one is data that we gather from universities directly. And I always say this, but it's a genuine thanks to your institutions for supporting us by providing that data. We know that it can be challenging to do that. We're asking for some quite detailed data in all 11 areas plus overall. This year, 1,643 universities put data into that system. Now, clearly, Phil has already said that only 1,258 were ranked. But many other universities who are on their road to being ranked include their data because they want to understand how much further they have to go. And it builds that data set so that when they eventually do join the rankings, we have some insight into their progress and how they got there. Our second major data set is the data we gather by surveying academics around the world. We use Elsevier's Scopus data set of authors to actually identify people who are actually working in academia, and we ask them their opinion, their understanding of which universities are producing the best research and which universities are producing the best teaching. Last year, we had 173,000 and a bit votes. And of course, we used 2 years of data from the survey to give us a broader insight. And our final data set, which I'm not going to talk a lot about because we have M'hamed here, is the data we get directly from Elsevier. And this provides us crucially with both insight into the quality, if you like, of the research that's being produced, but also in terms of the productivity, the number of papers, and also in terms of the international collaboration that takes place between your institutions. So I said that we had 1,600 universities that provided data and only 1,258 that were in the ranking. So what are our inclusion criteria? Our first inclusion criteria isn't even on this slide. Our first inclusion criteria is that universities participate by supplying data. We don't scrape data from websites. But once we have that, our first inclusion criteria, and the one that causes most universities not to get into the rankings, is around productivity. We require a minimum of 1,000 papers, and I use that term quite broadly. M'hamed will go into more detail. 1,000 papers over a 5-year period with a minimum of 150 in any year. The 150 limit was introduced a few years ago. It used to be 200 per year, but when we did that, we found we were discriminating particularly against relatively new institutions who are growing their output rapidly. We require universities to teach undergraduates. We're looking at research-intensive universities, absolutely, but those who also have a teaching mission. And we want these universities to genuinely teach across multiple subjects, not just be an institution purely dedicated to a particular subject, however important that might be. And the number of universities has, I only put this slide in here, by the way, to demonstrate that I know how to use PowerPoint, particularly how to do builds and animations. When Phil introduced the methodology back in 2004, we only ranked 200 universities across the world, 200 out of approximately 20,000. When we moved to the second version of the methodology in 2010, Phil extended that to 400 universities. In 2015, we went up to 800 universities. 2016, we went up to 983 universities. The black line was my target of 1,000 universities, and we just missed in that year. My boss, Trevor, came into the meeting saying, can we find 17 universities? We had an interesting discussion, and I managed to maintain us to the universities that should qualify rather than those that made us to 1,000 universities. In 2018, last year, we got to 1,102 universities, and this year up to 1,258 universities. An interesting question, of course, would be how many universities do we think would actually qualify? Now, that's a moving target because the data set that Elsevier are providing is expanding as they incorporate more journals, but also because universities are increasing their output. There is more and more research being done around the world every year. Universities are producing more good quality research, and so the numbers keep increasing. We think at the moment there are probably about 2,300 universities who publish more than 1,000 academic papers. So that's the potential pool at the moment. So why does the scope matter? Why do we care that there are more universities in than there used to be? Well, it's partly about equity. We want to make sure that where there are universities doing great research, we do actually understand how well they're doing. We do give them the opportunity to shine in the rankings. But when we look at the way we put the ranking together, and this is my preferred version, I know that Phil likes his nice journalistic waterfall-y thing. I prefer this. This is a Sankey diagram. It shows flows of data. So this doesn't work as a laser pointer against this. Good job I have long arms. On the far left-hand side, we can see our 3 data sets. The portal is the data that we gather from universities. Then we have our reputation survey, and then we have Scopus. And we can see that each of those is roughly worth the same, or is involved in the same proportion of the final output. We then generate 13 different measures. Each of those is trying to capture a specific aspect that we look for in excellence in universities, as Phil talked about earlier. We gather those into 5 broad areas. So when you look through the wonderful telephone directory book that was produced last night, fantastic insight, but also all the details in the table. Those are the 5 areas we provide that data in. And that finally goes into a single ranking. But you can see in those 13 different measures that we have some very different things. We have citations. We have income per member of staff. We have PhDs to first degree ratio. Those are measuring very different things. We can't directly compare those. So in order to get to the point where we can compare them, can bring them together, we normalize. And we normalize using a Z-scoring approach. Z-scoring, this is my one technical part of the presentation, I think. Z-scoring effectively depends on your population. So as we increase the number of universities in the ranking, the scores in that population change as we add more. And typically, we're adding more universities who are earlier on in their development cycle. They're doing research which is perhaps not as strong as some of the universities who've been around since the 2004 ranking. And so they tend to come in lower down in the ranking. It would be quite surprising to me if a new university came in the top 10, for example. And so we see that those distributions being stretched, particularly at the bottom. We're very pleased, though, to have 5 new countries represented this year in the rankings. I thought, we haven't done this before, but I thought it would be really nice to call out these countries and these universities, because it is excellent to see that we're not just relying on the USA, we're not just relying on Western Europe, that genuinely throughout the world, universities are coming up to the standards that we require to be entered into the rankings. So in Tanzania, we have the University of Dar es Salaam. In Iraq, we have the University of Baghdad. From Nepal, I apologize if there is anyone here from Nepal, because I'll almost certainly pronounce this incorrectly. Tribhuvan University from Nepal. We have the University of the West Indies from Jamaica. And we have 2 universities from Kazakhstan, the Al-Farabi Kazakh National University and the Elen Gumilyov Eurasian National University. It's fantastic to see new countries coming to the ranking and the data demonstrating that around the world we are genuinely seeing fantastic research. And this is the good news. What methodology changes were there from last year? Well, we increased the number of universities, and we're widening the criteria for entry to the subject rankings. So previously we had very strict criteria. We've loosened those slightly after some input from universities, and that input from universities is really important to us, by the way. If you see elements of the way we calculate things or the way we look at things that you think are wrong, talk to us. We may not agree with you, but if we do, we will genuinely change things to try and improve the rankings. So this is, for those of you who were here on Monday, you've seen these numbers, but these will be the number of universities ranked in each of the 11 subject areas this year. And we'll be releasing the actual rankings for the subjects later on in the year. But we can see that in some subjects, such as physical sciences, engineering, and technology, there are almost 1,000 universities who are producing fantastic research in those areas, and who we can rank as a result. With that, I'm going to hand over to M'hamed, who can take us through some of the Elsevier data, and then I'll be back on, I'm afraid, to talk about some of the outputs at a country level.
Thank you, Duncan. Let's see how much we do not repeat what we said on Tuesday, because otherwise it might get boring indeed. I hope not. So what I'll do then next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll really try to keep this short, is to first refresh a little bit, give a refreshment regarding what Scopus is. and I know, I've been doing this, I think, for the fourth time now, and every time there's this challenge, how much something new we are saying and not just repeat the story. And always this dilemma of maybe half of the audience know what Scopus is, I hope it is, and the other half maybe not. So I'll try to balance the story a little bit and then dive into some insights from the results of the 2019 results, particularly the site score, since I'm standing here as a partner for Times Higher, or actually we see each other more than partners these days, but to tell you more about the citation part of the story, which is 30%. And then there is also obviously the international co-authors papers, which provide for the international outlook, and the number of publication per institution, which is used for the research part, the productivity part. Now, without no overdue, very quickly on Scopus, and I tried actually to summarize the entire story of Scopus, which we launched back in November 2004, into one single slide, which does a lot of injustice to the number of things that this database is actually capable to do. So, what is Scopus? It's the largest abstract and A&R database that is curated and that is supervised by an international board that makes decision on titles that can be added to Scopus. In other words, we as Scopus, we as Elsevier do not decide really on the journals that make it to Scopus, and I'll say a little bit more about that. We do that by collecting the publication from these journals covering more than 5,000 publishers. And we do a lot of magical stuff with the data. I can say this without, with a bit of a pride, because we do what we call entity resolution, disambiguation, which allows us, for example, when you see the number of authors we have in Scopus, the number of author profiles, I should say, it allows us, for example, to identify those researchers or these authors that we want to reach out for the reputation survey, as an example. But obviously, we use the same data for research evaluation of individuals, showcasing, create your CV, for example. And by disambiguation, without getting into the details, I mean the identification of John Smith from J. Smith, from, go from strings of text to actual entity. The same thing we do with institutions, which allows us, again, to do rankings by grouping all the papers that belong to a lab or to a faculty, whatever, under one single institution. And we have a lot of flexibility there. And we work typically together with Times Higher for the ranking purpose to make sure that we map what we have in Scopus to the data that is provided through the collection process. Now, on the bottom part of the slide, you see the breakdown of the journals we cover across, or the series as we call them, across journals, since most of the research is done in journals, but also on conferences to support subject areas like computer sciences and engineering, where we know, of course, that researchers mostly use that to publish. We also added 4 or 5 years back a lot of books, particularly in the social sciences area, since we also know that social sciences on its own is quite a specific subject where people actually publish much more in books rather than in articles. You can actually fairly see on the left side the breakdown per subject area from a high level between physical sciences, health, and social sciences. And again, the critic has always been, is this database covering enough from my subject area, particularly social sciences, which I think we've done reasonable. I'm not going to claim here to say that this is the universe, but I think, again, it's the one that has the most comprehensive coverage to initiatives like rankings in particular, and certainly the subject rankings as well. Now, I realize that nobody can see this because of the resolution. I already seen some of the questions there. It's difficult to see. We will share the slides. But the essence of this slide here is just to give you an idea about the number of titles we added since January 2011. And you can see more than 10,000, where we have the acceptance rate roughly almost 50%, 47% to be precise. Remind me again, this is not Elsevier's decision to add or to suspend titles in Scopus. It's done really by an independent board. So I encourage everybody who thinks they can produce good journals in the sense that they have good research, actual research that contributes to the research community, to submit these journals for review to Scopus. The chart is supposed that you can see countries and acceptance and rejection rate per country. There's a lot of countries, obviously, but this is just the idea. It's not necessarily for you to see the actual countries. If you're interested, again, we can share the actual data behind each data point there. Now, if we look at the data set for this particular year, I always do this again just to refresh the minds again. This is how we break down the data set that has been prepared for the ranking, particularly because we don't use the entire Scopus, as you might know. It's only the period 2013-2007. Next year is going to shift one single year to become 2014-2018. We do take the citation to the point of presence. So for this particular ranking for this year, we take the snapshot on July. So in July timeframe of this year, we take all the citations received by those papers in those periods to date to calculate the field-weighted citation impact, which we'll see in a minute. And again, you can see the document types, breakdown articles, the typical 5 document types we use. So maybe one last thing here, and you might have seen this in maybe some correspondence, wherever. The same board that is responsible for adding titles in Scopus, they are also responsible to suspend titles. Sometimes we do that when we see some let's say predatory behavior that does not make sense for a journal. For example, either the metrics that were set are not healthy, or they do not look normal. To give you an example, we've seen, for example, some journals producing few papers a year, 50, 60, and suddenly we see 500 papers in one single year, and then it goes back down, which is a bit, let's say, abnormal compared to the rest of the population. Suspension does not mean exclusion. It simply means that it's suspended and it's subject to review one more time. Again, if the behavior seems to be normal, we can put them back. For the THE data set, we do exclude all the papers that belong to those suspended titles. And sometimes it may have implication on the site score, I have to say. All right, so this is very quickly, again, not to show off on the numbers. This is just to give you an idea about the numbers we've been playing with. I think Phil mentioned the number of publications, citations. You can see how many languages are covered by all these citations, 54. Again, just because people always believe we only cover English, although I have to say that 90%-ish is really English, but still there is a long tail of other languages covered. And maybe just to give you a particular example, so the most cited paper here has more than 17,000 citations, and I think it's published by authors from Tokyo, Arizona, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. The reason I'm showing this because this paper is his 2013 paper, which means that next year this paper will not be counted anymore for the citation score, and there could be some implication for the universities because this is clearly a paper that just contributes to the citation score significantly. Okay, this is just a reflection back to where we started back in 2015 when we provided the very first data set to Times Higher Education. I did not list the number of universities because I think it's known. I believe in 2014 there were 400 universities. We are now at 1,258. It's tripling actually the number. If you look at the data sets that we produced, it's growing at 4.5%, which is pretty much the growth that is within Scopus. So as we add more incremental data, more journals, Scopus grows every year at 4.5. On Tuesday, for example, Duncan showed the slide that I showed previously with 68 million. So exactly this time last year, we had 68 million articles in Scopus. Now we have 72 million. If you look at the citation, the growth rate there is at 10%. Let's dive into some analysis very quickly, again, bearing in mind the time, about some analysis that I quickly conducted for the sake of giving you an idea about what happened with the data this year compared particularly to last year. So the very first thing I did was just looking at the citation score of last year versus this year. So the x-axis is of last year, and the y-axis is of this year. And you can see that the correlation is very strong, but again, correlation is just to say that the methodology is sound. There are not a lot of outliers. However, you do see some outliers there, particularly those on the bottom side here. And again, I'm sure people will be willing to know what happened. I'm happy to explain per case. I admit I did not check every single case on its own because the reasons could be different. At least I checked a couple of cases where I found something interesting. But I'm happy, again, to explain to whoever has noticed a drop in their citation score what happened there. When we looked at the total number of institutions, maybe I skipped this. Each dot here represents an institution, just to be clear. And I looked at the number of institutions that gained versus those that let's say, have a lower citation score. And you can see the distribution. There's 61% versus 39%. Crazy enough, there was one single institution that scored exactly the same thing as last year, which is quite peculiar. Now, the other analysis that I looked at, also because I've been making that point so many times, to the point maybe it got boring, which is about the international collaboration and its implication on your citation score. I think we've been saying all these years, you want more citations, you need to be more internationally connected and therefore work internationally because you receive more citations. And more citations, by definitions, mean a higher citation score. And I'm using the field-weighted citation impact because it's actually the metrics that makes the citation score. The field-weighted citation impact is our measure to look at citations, but normalizing them by type, articles versus reviews versus conference papers, normalize them by age, older article compared to against older article, and not against newer, because the newer article obviously have less citations, and by subject, of course. So the story here is that the correlation is there, which really means, again, the more you internationally co-author or collaborate, the higher your field-weighted citation impact, and therefore your citation score. Now, I just repeated this by excluding the United States, simply because we know the United States are much more United States focused, so there is much more interstate collaboration rather than international collaboration. And you can see that this collaboration is actually even higher. So the story here is international collaboration. I think the minister said it yesterday. Is still an important factor. And of course, there are many reasons for international collaboration on projects, etc. The driver should not be the citations, but it's a bonus, so to say, that you get out of this international collaboration. Now, maybe the last couple of analyses that I've done is something different. So I've been also looking at what drives this high field-weighted citation impact other than international collaboration. One new concept that we launched in one of our platforms called Scival, which is our analytical platform that runs on Scopus data, is what we call topics of prominence. So maybe worth explaining what that is. So the topics of prominence, or topics in this particular case, the definition of it is a set of publications that addresses a specific research topic or research project. And these papers are cited by each other a lot. That's what they have in common. The prominence, which means much more the momentum of that research. Is it something new? Is it something that's driving new? What is the perspective of future of that topic, of that research topic? Is calculated using a couple of metrics like recent citations received, recent article views, which tells us a little bit about what happens right now, which is a leading indicator to what could happen in the future. And we also look at the impact, of the journal performance, where we use site score for that matter. So what I've done here is I looked at the number of publications and how they are distributed among topics. In other words, the more topics you have, and that's what actually the x-axis says. It's the number of topics, again, distributed among the number of publications. So the more topics you have, which means that you are quite all around within a specific faculty. This is not to be confused with faculties. I'm not saying, you should, there are faculties that might not be interested, or subject areas. This goes quite narrow because we have 100,000 topics. And the more you're spreading your research, as it looks here, the lower your field-weighted citation impact is. This could be controversial or maybe provocative, but again, this is just fact-based. The more topics you are doing, meaning you're publishing so many topics, it tends to lower your field-weighted citation impact, and there is a correlation, maybe not very, very strong, but there is certainly one. And actually, to to illustrate that with an example in specific countries, I looked at the United States and China in particular. And in the US, you can see the correlation is quite strong. Again, the more topics you have, which is this higher, the lower the field-weighted citation impact. And actually, the same thing applies for China, even maybe less. But it's almost like two parallel lines. The difference is that China has a lower field-weighted citation impact, but there are other reasons for that, like the English Journal, like the international collaboration. So I'm trying to give you some insight about how can you look into what drives actually your citation score and how you could potentially reconsider potential strategies within your university and your departments or faculties. With that, I'd like to hand it back to you, Duncan, to go maybe through the other results. Thank you.
Thank you, M'hamed. So I tend to do a version of this slide most years. And what we're looking here at is a simple bar chart. I was thinking about a pie chart, but it probably wouldn't work. A simple bar chart of the average score of universities by country. And as we've seen for the last few years, this is dominated by Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands. So congratulations, Singapore. You are indeed doing exceptionally well. But outside Singapore and Hong Kong, we can see the blue. The light blue there are European countries. Red is American countries. So in this case, we've got the USA and Canada. In green, we have the Australasian countries. In purple, we have, always looks quite dark on there, we have Asian countries. And in grey, we have countries in the Middle East. So we can see that actually the rankings overall tend to be dominated by Europe, Australasia, the USA, and Canada. So there's a clear aspect of that. Now, one of the challenges, I mean, it's good to see, however, that we do have, Middle Eastern countries. Saudi Arabia there is coming through. Israel is in there. Qatar is in there. So there is some excellent research going on, but still there is this domination of the traditional Western countries. Now, I'm going to be a little bit unkind to Singapore next because, of course, some of these countries only have one or two universities in the rankings. So when that tends to be the case, we're looking at the leading university in a country, and I wanted to get a picture which actually looked a bit more broadly. So I redid the slide with only those countries where we have more than 5 universities. So apologies to Singapore, Nanyang Technological University and NUS both do excellently and push you up. We're going to just assume that you would be on the left-hand side of these graphs for the next few. So when we look at the same data, but just looking at those countries where we have more than 5 universities, again, that's made even more obvious. We can see that dominance by English language speaking countries or countries who have, or in the European tradition, is very, very visible there. But of course, we don't just look at this in terms of the overall score, we can actually look at this in some of the individual areas. And when we do so, we start to see some slightly different patterns. So again, with n being greater than 5, if we look at the teaching score, yes, this is still dominated by European nations, but we can see, well, you can't see, you'll have to trust me on this. China is in there doing surprisingly well, or I was quite surprised by how well it was doing. And when we move across to look at industry income, we truly see Asia starting, or Asian countries to start to make more of an impact on the ranking. In fact, the US dropped significantly. The UK isn't even on this top 20. South Africa also coming in there, the orange bar in there, the African nations. And so we can start to see that actually there are different aspects where different parts of the world tend to do better than others. When we look at research, so research focuses on research reputation, research income, and productivity. Citations, as we've heard, looks at the quality of output. But if we look at where the income is going, that's the research side and the reputation, again, we can see that the USA is doing very well. The Netherlands, by the way, is the country to the left on most of these charts. Traditional countries are doing quite well. But the slightly disappointing fact is then when we look back at citations, again, it's the domination, and I suspect it's the domination of English language publications that is driving a lot of the citation scores. And it's a kind of a cycle whereby, because English is the dominant language in publication, if you publish in English, you have more chance of being read and more chance of being cited and so on. And we see the almost complete lack of the Asian nations there other than Hong Kong, which of course has a long history of English language publication. But that's not the only thing. We shouldn't always just look at the top. We should also look at how things are growing. And one of the remarkable stories about higher education over the last 20 years has been the growth of the Chinese higher education system and the increasing internationalization of it. This is the distribution of universities from China in the ranking that we published in 2015. And what I'm going to do is just advance through this and show you how that distribution has changed. As the number of universities that we've ranked from China has grown, it's almost doubled from 40 in 2015 up to 72 this year. So we can see there in 2015, we had Tsinghua and Peking University obviously doing very well. And we had some universities, that bulk of universities, towards the bottom end of the ranking. So we move into 2016, 2017. That bulk of universities at the bottom is growing, and it's also starting to shift to the left. Those universities are starting to move up the ranking. We can see the peak there as more come in 2018, and then finally this year, we can see where we've got to. So there's a real change there. Not only are we seeing more and more Chinese universities coming in, but actually the universities in the ranking are increasingly being recognized in terms of their performance. It's actually significantly moving forward. Now, of course, that does have some implications when we look at the averages for China. The more universities who come in, particularly as they come in on the right-hand side of the graph, depresses some of the averages. We can also look at how that performance is changing. This is the change from 2018 to 2019 for a couple of countries, which I thought were quite interesting. This is the change for India. And what we can see here is, for those of you who aren't familiar with waterfall charts, we start at 0, we take off the ones where the change has been negative, then we add back the ones, in this case the metrics where the change has been positive, to come to an overall change. In terms of Indian universities, the overall change has been positive. On average, Indian universities have moved up. And the areas where they've done particularly well, citations. The citation score of Indian universities has been improving on average. Now, obviously, there are some Indian universities who will go down, some who will go up, and so on. So I can see that the movement from 2018 to 2019 has been quite positive for India. Another country, I'm very pleased to see this, by the way, because for the last few years, we've been coming to these conferences and saying it's been another challenging year for Japan. In fact, I use the word challenging so much that my boss is telling me I'm not allowed to say challenging anymore, which means I now need to say it's been an opportunity year. But truly this year, actually, the news for Japan is much better. We've seen a fairly significant improvement. And one of the exciting things for me is that this is not an improvement driven by a single metric. It's actually across many of the metrics, a fairly consistent pattern. So again, citations has been improved, student-to-staff ratio is improving, research income per staff is improving, and so on. Now again, individual Japanese universities may have moved down and may have moved up, but on average, this is what we're seeing. China, we're seeing something slightly different. I thought this was worth mentioning because, as I said, this is driven by the fact that we have many more Chinese universities. So we're not comparing a like-for-like data set. And the universities who are typically coming into the rankings from China are universities with less established research traditions. So what's happening is we're seeing ones with lower citation score, and we can see there the citations has dropped. We fully expect, given what we've seen in terms of the movement, that that will drift upwards, that will move upwards over the next few years as those universities develop out their research base, develop out their productivity. It's always worth looking at the US. It's been a fractionally negative year. There was a slight increase in the number of US institutions, but one of the differences here is, remember, the US has 7,500 universities. We're looking at 170 of those, the very top of the R1, R2 universities. And we're seeing a slight decrease overall. The biggest fall area there was citations. Research reputation, teaching reputation are still, though, very strong and increasing for US institutions. Now, we're always criticized about the use of reputation, but there's an interesting way of exploring the balance between reputation and citations. You can view citation as being the more objective of those two measurements, and reputation being the more subjective of those two measurements. Although, personally, as someone who works in data, I find this desire to have two different camps, one is objectivity and one is subjectivity, a bit of a false dichotomy. It's a much more blurred range of definition in terms of data. But if we look at how Australian universities have moved over the last 3 years, so this is tracking only the universities who have been in our ranking for the last 3 years, and looking at how they move when we look at what we call a SWOT chart. So on the horizontal axis, we have their citation score, so the objective measure, how well are they performing in terms of the research. In terms of the vertical axis, we have reputation, how well do people perceive they're performing. And what we can see in Australia is that most universities are moving upwards in terms of the quality of research that they are producing as measured by citations. But this isn't necessarily reflected in the way they are being perceived in the world. Actually, the perception isn't moving up for the vast majority of those universities. They're moving from left to right. A few of the top universities are finding that their reputation is decreasing over time. We'll have a think about why that might be in a few minutes. In China, on the other hand, we're seeing something quite different. So in China, we're seeing universities starting from a much lower point than Australia in terms of citations. Starting point is that their citation scores aren't nearly as strong. But we're seeing a movement both in terms of rapid drive to the right, not as far as Australia yet, but moving. But also for many of the institutions, a significant upward rise in terms of reputation. Now, it's not for all of the Chinese universities, but certainly the leading ones, the ones that have started to move up, plus Tsinghua, plus Peking, we're seeing that their reputation is rising as well. I like it when we have charts that are conclusive, or at least where I can draw an inference. However, there are some charts where I find this more difficult, and I hate to pick on France. I really do hate to pick on France. But France is in an area of opportunity. Now, what we're seeing in France is actually the reflection of a system that is undergoing a lot of change. And there's an important lesson for all of us in this. You know, where we have governments, where we have a higher education sector which is well established, which is in a period of stability, actually we can see easily how improvements are coming, or indeed how problems are arising. But in France at the moment, there are still these huge changes in their education system which are undergoing, and that's having a direct impact here. We can see that we're seeing a lot of movement there. The big rise, the arrow on the right which has a big rise is PSL, which is of course the new institution which is coming together and establishing itself and gathering in the reputation that was previously distributed across multiple institutions. So we're seeing a lot of variability in France. And I really put it in there partly just to say, you know, not everything in data is clear, but also to emphasize the value of stability in terms of systems. When our governments come along and for whatever excellent reasons they have, decide to put their fingers or thumbs on the scales, it does have a knock-on effect, not just in terms of the day-to-day work, but how your research is generated, how productive it is, and indeed how you're perceived on the world stage. So why was the, I said I would try and briefly address this idea of why the reputation of Australian universities, particularly the top Australian universities, was decreasing. And hopefully these charts, if you could see them from the back, these charts would help give some insight into that. This is looking at how the average reputation score for teaching and research, teaching on the right, research on the left, by country, how those have changed. At the top, no surprise, is the United States. And you can see that there really hasn't been much of a Trump effect there. So far, reputation of US institutions doesn't seem to have suffered or gained. Let's be opportunistic about that. Could go up. The reputation for US institutions is fairly stable there. The big rise, though, in both of those charts is the reputation of Chinese institutions. that reputation has risen fairly consistently. There's a slight tail off in that rise this year, but still we're seeing that reputation increase. And of course, if the reputation for the Chinese institutions increases because of the way that we ask people to vote, those votes have to come from somewhere. And so what we're seeing is that most of the other nations in there that include South Korea, they include the UK, Germany, etc., we're seeing for many of those countries a decrease because the votes that previously went to them are going elsewhere. It tends not to affect the very top universities. Let's be clear. Oxford and Cambridge don't really suffer from that. They still get those votes. But as we move slightly further down the hierarchy of universities, or the perceived hierarchy of universities, we do see those votes starting to move elsewhere. There is some positives there, though. India is actually on a slight rise. That, again, is very positive. But there is this challenge. We have this zero-sum game going on here. As votes go to one nation or one set of universities, they have to come from somewhere else. And that takes me really back to a little bit of a reflection on where we are. We've had some interesting questions come through. Some questions, as always, about are we overemphasizing reputation? For those of you who think that that's an issue, I recommend you come to the panel session that I'll be speaking on later this afternoon, where I can almost guarantee that question will come up and we'll have a panel discussion where we can explore what we think about reputation. We are looking to, however, to think about our methodology going forwards, and we had a session which about half of you came to, I think, from the hands earlier on Tuesday, where we explored some of the opportunities there. And that could mean looking at things we can do to enhance how we get reputation data, how we can take out some of the variability, which, as I implied, tends not to be at the top end. I can guarantee MIT, I can pretty much tell you how many votes MIT will get next year, how many votes Harvard will get next year. But as we move down the tail of the distribution, then actually there is more variability there as we end up with smaller number of votes. So we're exploring ways we can make that better, but we can also think about how we shape the ranking overall. And so one of the questions I asked people who came to my workshop was exactly that. How should we reshape the ranking? If we think that we have these 5 broad areas, so reminder, citations, industry, income, international outlook, research and teaching, we can see there at the moment, citations, research and teaching have reached 30% of the ranking. Industry income is 2.5%. International outlook is 7.5%. So I asked people, would you like to, for those areas, take them one at a time, would you increase them, decrease them, keep them the same? And this is the results from this. Not very helpfully, on average, everyone wants everything to increase a bit. So I need to have a ranking of 120% of the data. The nice thing was that, broadly speaking, the middle point, which is neither increasing or decreasing, was the most popular answer in each case. You can see that the one that is closest to a balance is probably research, but for most of the others, the average view was that they should increase slightly. So that gives us an interesting insight. It does make life much more challenging for me as we think to how we might develop this, not for next year, probably not for the year after, but the year after that. And with that, I think we do have a little bit of time for questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have a very brief period of time. There's lots of questions coming in from Slido. Thanks also for some of your live feedback. It's very sobering to hear your commentary on our presentation. But what I suggest is we take questions from the audience now. We've only got 3 or 4 minutes. And what M'hamed and Duncan and I will actually record our answers to every single one of these questions and distribute the answers to all of you. And absolutely the slides, the full presentation will be available to all delegates. I appreciate it's been slightly challenging to read it all. So the slides will come and we'll send an audio file as well with all of our answers to your detailed questions. But for now, is there any show of hands from the audience? We can squeeze 2 or 3 in. There's a gentleman at the front here, if you have a microphone, please. If you could just say who you are and be as brief as possible, because we'll try and squeeze a few, and we only have 2 or 3 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Tawana. I'm from Wits University in South Africa. I just want to, if I put it to you this way, the reputation survey is really a perception index by those who are included to respond to the survey, and I think that's a major weakness.
Well, as many academics do, that was a statement rather than a question, but it is a good point. So it is a perception, but I think it has two major values. One is that actually perception is valuable to you, because, like it or not, that is how people see universities. Now, we try our best to make sure it's balanced and it's fairly distributed, geographically speaking. But we also have an interesting challenge, which is that our major measure of academic quality, the citations measure, works very well in some subjects, STEM subjects largely, doesn't work as well in arts and humanities, and doesn't work at all for some areas like fine arts. So we need to actually find a way that brings some of that insight in. When Phil was designing this version of the methodology back in 2010, that was one of the goals of the reputation element, was to try and cover some of the areas which aren't particularly well covered by citations, however much Elsevier try.
We can squeeze another one in if anyone has a hand. There is 23 questions on slide A, which we will deal with, but anyone else want to squeeze one in now? Final question? No? Well, we can probably take... The nice thing is that you're all asking these questions anonymously. We'd like to know who you are. One question that's just come through, do you normalize or not?
All over the place.
Many areas.
There are several different normalizations. The predominant one we use is Z-scoring of the metrics, with the exception of reputation, which doesn't have a distribution which would make that sensible. But we also try and make it as fair as possible by using ratios which relate to the size of the institution. When we look at financial data, we use purchase price parity, which goes beyond exchange rates. If you use exchange rates, you don't get a very good feel for the equivalent purchasing power. And that's what we're really trying to say is, if you have a certain amount of income, how much educational resource would that allow you to buy in your local country? So yes, there's lots of normalization that takes place. It's a positive and a negative. The good thing is it helps us to get data that is comparable. The downside is, of course, that then there's this function gap, if you like, between the raw data and the data you see when you look at the scores.
M'hamed, do you want to say a bit more about the masses of amounts of normalization we do, or you do, on field-weighted citation impact?
Yeah, so I tried to explain that. So next to the Z-score, which we do in order to balance this within the population itself, the field-weighted citation impact, which is, again, the metric we use for citations, is already normalized by itself. We calculate that, and I think on Tuesday I even showed a mathematic formula to kind of maybe make things look a little bit complex, which is really not it. The metric itself uses citations, as I mentioned, and there's 3 dimensions. The age of the paper, because you cannot compare, as I said, a paper that is recently published, which will not have a lot of citations, against an old paper. That's one thing. The other thing is we look at reviews against reviews, chapters against book chapters, just to make sure we have apple-to-apple comparison. That's another way to normalize. And the third dimension is the subject discipline. Obviously, if you get 1 citation in social sciences, it means something different than the 1 citation that you will receive in medicine or physics. So we take these dimensions to make sure that we do really normalize and have an apple-to-apple comparison, and to be fair to each article. And we aggregate them to a specific entity, in this case, to an institution, because we want to report back on an institutional level, just to keep it short.
Thank you very much. We will squeeze one more in, I think. Duncan, there's a question about the profile of our reputation survey respondents. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
So we do collect some information on responders, and we try and, well, we don't balance by it directly, but we do keep an eye on it. I think there's probably more we could do in terms of that, but it's quite challenging to do much more than review what the diversity is like. It's very challenging to try and balance for that, as well as balancing for geography and subject. You get into some very small potential cells there. Also, last year, for the first time, we started asking some questions from people about why they voted for the universities they did. We'll be exploring that again in more detail in the future, but that's a really interesting insight. You start to see differences both by universities, but also by for example, the career stage of researchers. You know, younger researchers tend to have slightly different perspectives on how they determine a university is good or bad than older researchers.
You might just add a small thing on that one, because I think it's a good question in the sense of diversity, and you could do a lot of things if you had the chance to do that. But I think one of the things we could do in the selection criteria, where we randomly select the number of authors to send the invitation out, we could potentially look into the gender-specific piece that I mentioned the other day, because in I think more than 85% of the cases in the Scopus author profile, we are able to actually identify female from male. And we might just balance that. I'm not sure whether females will respond better than male, things like that. But I think it's potentially a good input to consider that particular item.
And the basic premise there is we do it in 15 languages. We map the United Nations data on the genuine distribution of scholarship around the world, and we survey in the correct proportion. So we're surveying the right number of Chinese scholars, the right number of people from every country. So it's also incredibly balanced by country and by subject. So we have run out of time. Just to be really, really clear, all the PowerPoints are going to be distributed to all the delegates. There is actually full video of every session, and that's also going to be available to all the delegates. And to cover the questions that we haven't managed to cover in this time, I'm going to call on M'hamed and Duncan to work with me on an audio file as well, just to share the actual detailed responses to the questions we haven't managed to get to on Slido. But for now, if we could thank the panelists, please.